Hi, this is Adrian from Microsoft Learning, and we're going to be learning today about CSS and HTML and the ways in which they play together. So if you look at this file that I have open right now in Visual Studio Code, it's the gunpowder file, which you should be at least a little bit familiar with from the lesson. And it's pretty straightforward. You know, we've got a title, we've got a style section. This is where we're going to be making changes to the CSS later to make it look and feel a little bit different. And we've got our header tag, we've got our address, and of course the poem, which is being held in this fantastic paragraph tag. So before we get started, let's just take a look at what this looks like here in Microsoft Edge. And you can see it's pretty straightforward. You know, we've got our title, we've got author, and the poem, of course. But I think this looks a little bit boring. So let's change the way that this looks. The first thing I want to do is make all the text a little bit bigger. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to create a new sort of default text size such that everything in the file is now a little bit bigger, and that everything relative to that will be bigger as well. So I'm going to do that by creating a new rule for both body and HTML. I like to do both here because it eliminates some of the confusion. Different browsers have different ways of interpreting what is going to be sort of the default rule. So if you just do both like this, it'll be sort of ubiquitous in the way that it handles relative size. So let's just say we want to make a new font size that's, I don't know, 20 pixels. And you can see that Visual Studio Code gave me some handy tips for things that I might be talking about as soon as I typed in the word font, which is nice because CSS has such a huge vocabulary. It's good that you don't have to memorize every single little attribute. So we've changed this to 20. Let's open up the file again and see how that looks. You can see it's a little bit bigger, but I want to make this 25. It's not quite big enough yet, so we'll refresh the page and you can see the size has been changed very slightly. So that looks good, but I think this by John Milton text is a little bit too big, so I'm going to create a new rule specifically for that line. So how I'm going to do that is create a new address rule, and I'm going to make the font size of that to be 0.7 rem, so it's going to be a little bit smaller relative to the sort of default font size that we've set up here. You could just do EM just to make it consistent and not relative, but since we create a sort of this hard and fast rule for what the page is supposed to follow, it's good to do everything else relative because it makes it a little bit easier to change everything if you want to do a big overhaul. So we've changed that. Let's see how that looks. Text becomes a little bit smaller. That's all well and good. The next thing I want to do is, I think this font's a little bit boring, so what I'm going to do is make it something maybe a little bit more modern looking. So I'm going to go into our body rule here, and what I'm going to do is change the font family to sans serif. So you can see that looks a little bit different. I kind of want this by John Milton part to be the same though, so I'm going to leave that as the default. So we'll just say font family serif. And you can see that now it's back to its serifed default. And that looks great. So I think the next thing that we're going to do is maybe add a splash of color. You know, I think black and white is timeless and it's very readable, but it's a little bit boring. And what I'm going to do is make a new rule for the header. I'm going to make the title a very engaging and interesting color. Chartreuse or cyan. Let's do something a little bit more tasteful than that. We'll call it crimson. And you can see that it's a little bit bright, but looks better. Kind of pops out at you. And I'm going to do the same thing, but the opposite with this by John Milton text, because I think that needs to stand out a little bit less. So we'll call that, there's so many different colors to choose from. One of my favorites for kind of more background elements is dim gray. And you can see that looks a little bit more subtle, subdued. So I like how that's looking. And the next change we're going to make is, if you recall previously in the lesson, we learned about an attribute called line height, which is essentially encapsulates the distance between lines of text. So I think this is, you know, we've got all this vertical real estate on the page. I think we could stand to increase our line height a little bit, spread out those lines of text some, just to make it more readable. So we're going to make a new rule for our paragraph tag that contains the poem. And we're going to say line height, I don't know, we'll call it 1.2, so just a tiny bit bigger than default. We'll just see how much that changes it. That's not quite as much as I'd like, so we'll go back in, we'll call this 2.0, see how that looks. That's better. A lot of web development is trial and error, just sort of trying things and seeing how it looks, and then going back to the drawing board and experimenting. So I encourage you to play around with it. And the last little change that we're going to make is, I think that, you know, this looks interesting, but if you open it up to full size, you'll see that this header is kind of over here on the left, and I don't really like the way that looks. So I'm going to go into our H1 tag here, and I am going to say that the text align should be in the center. And what that's going to do is take this and move it to the center. One thing you should be aware of is that text align is relative to the container that something is being stored in. So you can see that this header is relative to the page. So if we resize the page, it actually just sort of changes the way that it looks. So be mindful of that. You know, we're in a day and age where so many different screen sizes are possible to be used, and you kind of have to consider how something looks for every orientation of a page in order to make sure that it looks good for everybody. So play around with that, and play around with some of the other attributes that I didn't get to in this little demo, because there are so many that we learned in the lesson, and I encourage you to mess around with them and just sort of see what each one does.